couple of years ago, I read this article about some new kinds of energy exploration that companies were doing. One of them, they were talking about launching solar panels into space. The problem with putting solar panels on roofs is that sometimes it's cloudy, or when it's dark at night, they don't work. But if you got them up above the clouds and they were going around the earth with the earth and always focused on the sun, then that energy could be gathered and beamed down to the earth by microwave transmitters. They talked about cutting bricks from the bottom of the sea where there's a lot of methane gas. Now, methane is the combustible gas that emerges from volcanoes and garbage dumps and cows, but it's also found deep under the ocean floor and in the Arctic permafrost, just waiting to be collected. It's a fossil fuel, but it releases very little carbon dioxide compared to coal and oil, so burning it could actually reduce our annual carbon dioxide emissions. There's been talk about nuclear fusion. Well, now this is the process of the sun that powers the sun, pretty much the best energy source ever. Unfortunately, we don't currently have the technology to power nuclear fusion reactors in an efficient and economical way, but scientists are getting closer, and there are side benefits to fusion that makes this process even more attractive, because fusion can eat up the nasty radioactive waste that comes out of modern nuclear fission plants. So you're fission and fusion, two different things. But it isn't just the world that needs more power. The church needs power too. Often we feel powerless in the face of chronic hunger, homelessness, and violence in our communities. Powerless to speak the many languages of our increasingly diverse neighborhoods. Powerless to stand up in the middle of an increasingly divided culture and offer a word of hope grounded in the promises of the gospel. The church needs power. God knows this, which is why the cleanest and greenest form of alternative energy came to a powerless church on Pentecost many years ago. The author writes, "Suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting." Was it wind power? Well, not exactly. He goes on, "Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them." Burning methane? No, that's a kind of combustion. The followers of Jesus weren't energized by wind or sunlight or methane or nuclear fusion. No, their power came from the Holy Spirit of God, a force that enabled them to speak in diverse languages and offer a word of good news, hope. Their power came from God. And it was a force that could and did change the world. And it's a power that is available to us in the church today. God's Spirit empowers the church. The followers of Jesus were gathered in a house in Jerusalem. Most likely as Jews, they were there to celebrate Pentecost, also called the Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot. Now, while we think of Pentecost as a Christian holiday, it was a Jewish holiday first. It was the festival at which the first fruits of the spring harvest were offered to God in thanksgiving, and it was a celebration of the giving of the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, the event which created the covenant between God and the Hebrews, establishing them as the people of God. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is resurrected, bestows the Holy Spirit on his disciples, and ascends into heaven all on the same day. The author of Luke Acts tells the story a little differently. Acts 1 tells us that Jesus is still with the disciples in Jerusalem for 40 days after his resurrection. And it's at that point that he ascends into heaven. But just before his ascension, Jesus promises them, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." It's on Pentecost, about 10 days later, that promise is fulfilled. God shows up with power, wind, fire, and noise. These manifestations are all marks of God's presence in the Hebrew Bible. In Exodus at Mount Sinai, God descends upon the mountain in smoke and fire and speaks in a voice of thunder. These same images for God's presence appear in 1 Kings when Elijah experiences God at Mount Horeb. First, there's a great wind so strong that it's splitting the mountains and breaking rocks. Then came the rumble of an earthquake and then a fire. And finally, after all of those, in that moment of silence, Elijah hears God. An experience of God was a noisy